You know what I really need is a whiteboard sponsor. Hey everyone, Dylan Schumacher, Citadel Defense, and we are here today to start what I hope to be a 4-part series on what I'm going to call the philosophy of war. Okay, this is a series that we're going to do, and we're going to do a little lecture series. We are going to use the Marine Manual 1, the MCDP 1-1. I think that's what it's called. I have my little table over here. Let's make sure we're titling this correctly. Yes. MCDP 1, Warfighting, by the U.S. Marine Corps. I will leave a link in the description down below. You can find a PDF of this online. It's not hard to find. I would suggest that you get yourself a copy of that, you print it out, or if you're a digital reader person, that's fine too. But get yourself a copy. And what I would suggest, and the way I would suggest using this lecture series, and what I hope it gets used for, is that you would read the chapter, and then that you would watch the lecture, and you would interact with it in your brain, right? And say, no, Dylan's a moron, that's not correct, or that is a good point, or that's helpful, or actually that makes me think of, and then you would use it to further your own thought process and learning. That's my goal for this 4-part series here. I'm not sure how long this is going to end up being. Maybe some of these chapters will be a little bit bigger, and we'll have to split them into 2 videos. But we'll just kind of see what happens. I first read this manual back in December of 2021. There is a review of it on this channel if you scroll back through my book review videos. And I've been on a pretty bad book streak recently, honestly, and not really enjoying much of what I've read. And so I thought it's time to go back to some old classics. So I'm rereading this one. And as I was rereading it, I thought this series would be very helpful because it's one of the best philosophy of war books I've ever read. It's not practical. It's not like how to do your reloads and how to clear corners. It's very philosophical level based of what are the driving and grounding principles of how we should conduct war. Now, this was written for the United States Marine Corps, so not all of that will apply to you, the everyday American Minuteman, but a lot of it does, because it's just general philosophy of war, general philosophy of how the Marine Corps wants to conduct operations. Whatever they do in reality versus what they say on paper, we can talk about that. But the paper itself of their theory and what they're trying to drive at is what I think you and me as everyday American Minutemen should drive at. So, again, that's the series. That's what we're going to talk through. We're going to call it the philosophy of war because that sounds really cool. And we are going to start here in chapter 1. And this video should serve as the first, like I said, of 4 lectures. So the very first thing we need to talk about is, what is war? So the nature of war. What is it? And I think, according to this document, and I think you'll find this true in historical experience, it comes down to really one word: will. It is the will, or imposing your will on your enemy, right? It is the will to win right? It is the will to not quit. It is the national resolve. It is the individual soldier's grit and determination. It is making the enemy do what I want. It is imposing my will upon them. That, at the end of the day, is really what war breaks down to. Getting the bad guy to comply with what you want through use of extreme violence. Military is not the only facet, should we say, of war, right? If you could convince other countries to not trade with them anymore, if you could leverage some different diplomatic connections to get them shut out of certain countries or destroy their alliances, right? These are all different facets of war. Predominantly here we're concerned with the military application. However, in all of those facets, what are you doing? You are imposing your will on the bad guy. You are attempting to ensure that they comply with what you want. So that imposition of will is really what war is going to break down to. That's what we're trying to accomplish. That's what they're trying to accomplish on us, right? This is not a static deal. They are trying to impose their will on us. We're trying to impose their will on them. They are making actions. We are reacting. We are making actions. They are reacting. There's give and flow and take and tempo. And that's the nature of it. So at the end of the day, the imposing your will on the bad guy is the goal. That's what we're trying to accomplish. You can see this, again, on a much smaller level in sports, right? They're trying to impose their will on the other team, right? They're trying to get more points than them. You can see this in fighting, like boxing, wrestling, jiu-jitsu, MMA, whatever. They're trying to impose their will on the other person, right? War is just those things on a much bigger level, grander scale, and much more violent. That's really what it boils down to at the end of the day. It is will. Now within this chapter, there's kind of three, they don't organize it this way, but I think this is the most helpful way to think about it. There's three kind of main headings of things that they're going to go through. The first one is the attributes of war, which we're going to talk about in a second. Then there's the human dimension of war. And then there's the evolution of war, or the parts that change and the parts that don't of war. So first of all, let's talk about the attributes of war. What is war like? What are the things that mark it, that are characteristics of warfare? The first one we're going to talk about is friction. Friction is when the otherwise easy becomes difficult, right? Or the difficult becomes extremely difficult. Friction is that added tension, it's the added problem, right? We all know what friction is in physics, right? Like things that don't glide easily. There's lots of stick. Like if I take two pieces of sandpaper and I stick them together and try to move them, or Velcro, right? There's a lot of grip. They're not going to easily just slide past one another. That's friction. So friction in combat, or we should more properly say combat causing friction, that means that things that were otherwise easy become more difficult. So for example, right, you're out in the field with your guys for 3 days or 5 days, let's say. Well, you have to eat food, you have to sleep, you have to poop and go to the bathroom, you have to do all these things. Now, if you're at your home and you want to go to the bathroom, well, you just walk into your bathroom and go to the bathroom. But if you're out in the field, that's a little bit different, right? You've got to go probably dig a hole because you don't want to get discovered. You need to make sure you don't get shot or blown up while you're going to the bathroom, right? And then you need to kind of cover your traces and go back. There's more friction involved there. It's a more difficult task. Now, add on top of that you just had a huge firefight and you've got a couple minor wounds and you're really tired, right? And the friction starts to stack. And that's one of the things about friction. It is a cumulative effect. All of the effects stack. So as you get tired, you can't think as clearly. And then because you can't think as clearly, something that shouldn't be that hard becomes a more difficult problem for you. And on top of that, again, someone's trying to kill you and you're trying to find and kill someone else, and on we go. And all of those effects stack to make things exceedingly more difficult. There's a quote here that they have at the beginning of the book by Karl von Clausewitz. Everything in war is simple, but the simplest thing is difficult. The difficulties accumulate and end by producing a kind of friction that is inconceivable unless one has experienced war. And I think that's a great quote on friction. It really encapsulates that idea that there's just more mess. Things are much harder to accomplish. So what goes really well in practice or goes really well in your battle drill, right, of doing an assault through or fire maneuver, all of a sudden becomes much more difficult, right? And that's just the nature of the beast. All of these things are the nature of the beast. You have to understand that there's no real way around them. They're gonna happen. The question isn't how do we make them not happen, although when we can reduce friction, we obviously like to. But the question is, how are we going to work in spite of them? How are we going to use them as weapons of opportunity against our opponents, right? If we know that they're at a maximum friction point or this certain activity causes them significant amount of friction, how can we use that as a weapon to come back to impose our will on the bad guy? Friction, by the way, this is one of the reasons that when they do selection events or whatever, that they are very difficult. They're trying to increase that friction, right? Well, you haven't slept for 2 days and now you need to memorize this list of 15 items in the next 5 minutes or whatever, right? That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to increase the friction. This is why, if you ever go to shooting classes and they start, using air horns and throwing smoke out and yelling at you, whatever. What are they trying to do? They're trying to cause friction. You've heard that called like simulate stress or whatever. I'm kind of whatever about that. That's probably a different video, different topic. But at the end of the day, again, what is that? It's friction. That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to introduce friction so that the simple becomes complex, or we should say the simple becomes difficult. This is also the reason that you need to practice your reloads 7 million times, right? So that when the gun comes out and the reload comes in, there's no thinking. It reduces friction there. This is also why you need to know how to clear your malfunctions, right? So that when you're tired and you've been at this for 3 hours and all of a sudden your gun locks up, you can just fix it. It doesn't require effort and energy that's going to add to the friction. This is why we practice battle drills a ton with your teammates, right? Again, we're trying to reduce the friction. We know that it's going to be very difficult when things get weird. So if we can practice it, make it super simple, and just beat it into our brains until, we can do it drunk and asleep at the same time, well, then that, of course, increases your chances of success. So that's why these things get repeated so much. You hear it called, muscle memory or whatever. But my point being, you're trying to do that a bunch so that when the friction hits, you're able to actually do it. That's why there's so much repetition. It can seem so simple. And like, well, this is too simple. Why do we do it this way? We could do it better or whatever. But you have to remember, a lot of these processes and things are built for an environment that's a high friction environment. All right, that's number one. I hope I spelled that right. That's uncertainty. If I spelled that wrong, I apologize. Uncertainty, right? So things are never certain. You can never know all the things. There's always going to be a degree of knowledge that you're missing, and hopefully that you're missing, right? If you've played real-time strategy games, I'm a big computer war game nerd person, and my favorite kind of game to play is real-time strategy games. And in real-time strategy games, you're moving little guys around a map, right? While other people are doing that, you're trying to beat each other. And one of the things that the games always simulate is the fog of war. And that just means you can't see the whole map. You can only see the map where your guys are. That's what that means in video game terms. So my point is, I don't know what the bad guy's doing. They don't know what I'm doing. We don't have perfect information on each other with which to act. So if I send some guys over here to take that hill, or if I send some guys over here to man this building, they could have guys already there. They could not. They could be in a totally different part of the map. I don't know. There's a degree of uncertainty there. And so I'm basing my moves off probability, off what I think the likely enemy course of action should be, what I would do if I were them, how this map generally plays out, and what I know people generally try to do as the general strategy, right? All of these things I'm factoring into my decisions of what I'm gonna do. War, combat, shocker, is just like that, right? That's what you're doing. You're making decisions based on probabilities, based on best guesses, based on known enemy tactics, based on what we're trying to accomplish with our mission, etc., etc. But you know that you're always dealing with a degree of uncertainty. Again, it's important to remember the bad guy also deals with degrees of uncertainty. They don't know everything either. they're also making guesses. They're also making best efforts. They're also having to deal with the uncertainty and just not knowing everything. And there are times when you can use this as a weapon to generate surprise, right? If we can lure the enemy into believing something that we would like them to believe, which has been done repeatedly in wars, both on the grand scale and the small scale, throughout all human history, so much the better. Then we can increase their uncertainty, right? And we can hopefully generate surprise to then radically overcome that in a moment and secure a better chance of victory for ourselves. So that's uncertainty. Again, you just have to understand, you don't know everything. There could be a company beyond that hill and you only have 10 guys. There could not be. You have to make that decision based on what you know you don't know. Again, likely enemy course of action, where you are in the battlefield, etc., etc., etc. And you're factoring all these decisions in to do the best with the information that you have at the time to make a decision. Number 3, fluidity. It's a changing environment. It's a fluid environment. It just changes. Combat is not stagnant, right? Even in World War I, where things were arguably the most stagnant in combat they've been in the last 100 years, things were still fluid. They introduced gas. The Americans introduced shotguns. The British introduced tanks. There were multiple evolutions and revolutions in using planes, right? At first they were just spotting. Then they were like dropping hand grenades. Then they put machine guns on them and were able to fire through the propellers because they were able to sync the engine in time to the guns going off so you don't shoot out your own propellers. Like, all these things happened. So even there, it's a fluid environment. Things are changing, right? Even, again, in one of the most stagnant wars, arguably in history on the Western Front, things are changing. How much more so in modern combat, right? You see this now where drones are the hot thing, right? Using drones to spot, using drones to kill, using drones. That's the hot thing right now. It's a fluid environment. Things are always changing, not just on the technology scale, but in the actual layout of the land, right? If enemies are moving around into different places, our guys are moving around into different places. Capabilities are being gained or lost. Certain units are being retired, so we no longer have that capability for the next 24 hours because they're on rest cycle or whatever. It's a constantly changing environment. What we thought was a secure town yesterday got attacked, and now we no longer own that town, and so therefore we can't go there anymore, right? And this plays again into uncertainty. Maybe you didn't know that and you got there and now things are really bad. Point being, because of this constantly changing environment, you have to be able to think on your feet and move on your feet. It's not something to sit down. If you're a person who really likes to know all the factors, study all the factors, and then make an informed decision after you thoroughly research each and every option, combat leadership probably is just tougher for you because this is more of a snap decision thing. There are things happening and you have to make decisions in real time in order to keep up with the pace of combat. If between the uncertainty and the friction and the fluidity, if you need to examine things for a long time before making decisions, again, that's going to be tougher for you and your role might not best be fit as a combat leader. And that's totally okay. You just have to understand the nature of the beast. Again, remember, your enemy is experiencing fluidity as much as you are, meaning that to them, things are constantly changing as well, and it's stagnant for no party in this engagement. Number 4, disorder. Obviously, or maybe it's not obvious, I guess it should be, war naturally moves here. War is naturally oriented towards disorder, right? Because it's destruction. You're trying to destroy other human beings and they're trying to destroy you. That's the nature, again, the nature of the beast. So it's naturally going to devolve towards that disorder. You are trying to bring order, right? We do that with units and command structures and order of fires and all these other things, right? But naturally, it tends towards the chaos and the disorder because you have two groups of people at the end of the day who are trying to impose their will on each other in maybe the most violent manner possible. We'll talk about that when we get to chapter 2, but probably a very, very violent and brutal manner, in which case that tends towards disorder. You look at any combat zone ever, and it is one of the markers of it is disorder, right? Again, go back to World War I and we look at those trench lines. Everything between the trench lines, they call it no man's land for a reason. It's disorder. It's shelled out things and lots of dead bodies and pieces of barbed wire, and it's disorder. It's chaos. War is naturally going to devolve there. Again, we're going to beat this dead horse. Remember, the bad guy experiences disorder as much as you do. This is something that, again, can be utilized as a weapon. They're going to experience the disorder. You're going to experience the disorder. Are there times when they're experiencing maximum disorder? Can you create maximum disorder among them so that you can strategically use that to accomplish specific objectives? For example, big army example, right? They will, you can shell an area with a bunch of artillery, right? Creating lots of disorder and chaos, and then follow it up right up with a on-the-ground foot assault, right? Or you could shell and disorder an area, causing lots of attention to come here because they have casualties and problems, while sending guys somewhere else to accomplish some other mission, right? We're speaking in big general terms here, but you get the idea. How can we utilize disorder as a weapon in order to exploit that and maximize that and bring our ordered objective purpose to sneak that in the midst of their disorder so they're unable to respond effectively? Another attribute of the nature of the beast. Number 5, complexity. It's complex. Why is it complex? Well, there's lots of moving parts here. Now, for the everyday Minuteman, you could say, oh, well, it's just me and my 6 guys. I'm not part of a fire team. That's part of a squad. That's part of a platoon. That's part of a company. It's part of a battalion. Up and up we go, right? That's not me. There's not a ton of moving parts. It's just me and my 6 guys. Well, even in a Minuteman scenario and China invades tomorrow, there's still a lot of moving parts. You still need people to put out propaganda and write papers and other marketing department type things. You still need people to procure supplies. You still need people to get information. You still need people to do the actual fighting. They need people to maybe get rid of the weapons. You need people to procure vehicles. You need people to maintain those vehicles. Like, this goes on and on and on. It's a very complex environment. There are a lot of moving pieces to get any one operation to be pull-offable, right? That's just always the case. And the more capabilities you stack in there, the more complex it gets. Again, big army example, right? You talk about loading up helicopters. Well, how much weight can the helicopters carry? What's their range? Do we need a refuel plan? How rested are the pilots? Do we need multiple pilots? How long is the mission? You understand where this is going, right? That's just the helicopters. Then you got to factor in the guys actually going, the equipment that needs to go, the mission to be accomplished, etc., etc. Again, I would like to reiterate that all of these factors are just the nature of the beast. They are the factors of how things are. They are problems for you to deal with and your team to deal with. They are also problems for the bad guy to deal with. It's very easy to think about, wow, and get caught up in yourself and what you're thinking and how you're reacting and how you're problem solving, and forget about trying to impose your will on the enemy. What are they thinking? How are they reacting? What are the problems they have to deal with? How can we use these at points as a weapon and a tool to continue to cause my enemy harm and make them submit to my will, right? Again, that's what we are trying to accomplish. Don't lose sight of the objective of imposing your will on the enemy, knowing you have to deal with these problems, knowing they have to deal with these problems, trying to maximize those problems for your bad guy, and minimize them, of course, for yourself. Those are the attributes of war. That's the first category. The second category here is the human dimension. Okay, there's 2 more attributes here that they have under the human dimension. The first one is the human dimension, and then there are 2 more, and I'm going to write them down and we're going to talk about them all in turn. So let's talk about these in turn / maybe all together, because they relate fairly closely. So the first one is the human dimension. War is a human endeavor, obviously, right? This is a human thing that we are trying to do. And so, because war is a human effort based around humans, it's subject to all the things that humans are subject to. So all of the different inconsistencies and perplexities and politicking and frustrations. And for example, I am always amazed, surprised. I don't know. When I was young, I was a young, ignorant man. And I always thought that, well, when the war's on and people are shooting, that somehow these human things go away. We don't have time to argue about politics or worry about careers because we need to kill the bad guy and they're trying to kill us. Turns out none of that is true whatsoever at all in any way, shape, or form. In wars, people regularly worry about looking good to their superiors and getting promotions and, you know, what their boss will think and how the public will react and, well, you know, maybe we shouldn't quite give them all those supplies because we might need to hold on to them later and all these kinds of things. These are human dimension factors. These all play into war. Just because the shooting starts and people are dying doesn't mean people stop being people. They still do all the stuff that they normally do in life, just now we do it with bullets flying overhead. Right? I'm being dramatic, but you understand what I'm saying. This is always still going to happen. It's impossible to remove the human dimension from a human effort. You just can't separate it. Because usually by the time we get to war, there are irreconcilable differences, right? Usually by the time we get to war, people have tried to talk them out, but they've just been unsuccessful and there's no more talking to be done, right? Because of that, usually emotions, tensions, these things are at an all-time high, right? Once the bloodletting starts, this is why civil wars are particularly brutal, right? Because there's a lot of pent-up emotion and anger and frustration and all this stuff. So that usually spikes in the beginning. It can escalate over time, it can diminish over time. We can talk about that. But there's a lot of anger and emotion and frustration, and all these things are real factors. You know, the book says, and I think it's correct, that war is one of the greatest trials of physical and moral stamina known to man. And I think that's correct because, again, there's all these people in one of the most difficult things, probably the most difficult, I guess I don't really know what would be more difficult, facets or scenarios of human creation, and it's just going to churn for a while. Well, that's going to do certain things. So the last thing I'd just like to say here, there is no degree of science, there is no degree of the evolution of war, which we'll get to in a bit, that will ever remove the human factor. We can put AI in charge of it, and we can have AI robots, and they can have AI robots, and they can just kill each other, and then whoever runs out of robots first wins the war. But even when I say that, that sounds silly, doesn't it? Because you know, and I know, at the end of the day, it's still about people. We can all make lots of robots and have all the robots kill each other, but that really wouldn't solve anything. At some point, people are going to have to be involved. That's just how it works. So because of that, we have violence and danger, right? Violence and danger, obviously in combat, are going to be ever present. That's, again, nature of the beast, kind of how the way the thing works. One of the ways that the Marine Manual talks about overcoming violence and danger is through excellent leadership. If you have a well-trained team of guys, they have faith in their leaders are driven with purpose, you're going to decrease the fear of the violence and danger and allow people to do their jobs in hard circumstances. Fortunately for you, as an everyday American Minuteman guy, you get to choose who you want to train with. You get to choose who you want to spend your time with. You get to choose to respect these men or not. And as a result of that, you get to choose to associate with them or not. And if you are garnering respect in your team and you're training together and you're building confidence in one another, that is going to behoove you significantly when it comes to the violence and danger aspect. Why? Well, these are my boys. I can't let them down, right? I'm not going to let my boys down. They trust me. They've vested in me certain amounts of responsibility. I will not fail them. And you're going to feel that, and they're going to feel that, and that is going to help you as a team overcome the fear of the violence and the danger to do what it is that needs doing. So as Minuteman leaders, you know, people who aspire to be team leaders or squad leaders or whatever, we have to understand fear. We have to know how to cope with it. We have to know how to push others through it. We have to have an understanding that it's going to be present. Of course, you know, it's going to happen, right? It's that quote about courage is not the absence of fear, but rather the doing what needs to be done in spite of the fear, right? That's bravery, that's courage. Everybody feels fear. Again, it's a human dimension thing, can't get rid of it. So the question is, how are we going to act through the fear? When we're afraid, when we're tired, how are we going to still do what needs being done? One of the answers to that is experience. Now, We can't all go out and get combat experience, although that's why veterans are generally steadier than non-veterans, right? Because they've experienced it before. They know how to cope. They've developed systems to respond and deal with the stress. They know what's important, what's not important. They're not overawed or overwhelmed. They're able to process through it. So experience tends to make us better fighters, more calm, more courageous. In the meantime, there are other little experience, and I put this in quote, things you can do, and this is why we train, right? We can train, we can go do force-on-force training with simunitions or miles gear or whatever. You can get those, those ups, you can get those dry runs, those practice runs, and you are gaining experience there. Now, there's something to be said about training scars and doing things wrongly just to cheat the game that wouldn't work in real life. Those are all legitimate, and we can talk about that. But the point is, are there different training things you can do to help gain that experience for you and your team? Are there different things that you can be doing to help work through the violence and the danger now, so that if you have to go into it for real, it's not the first time? Does that make sense? I hope you're tracking with that. I'm just going to read you this quote from the book for Physical, Moral, and Mental Forces here. War is characterized by the interaction of physical, moral, and mental forces. What does that mean? Physical forces are things we can understand. How many bullets we have, how many bad guys we killed, how many artillery rounds we have, how much fuel we have. That can be quantified, right? But there are other things like mental and moral forces that can't quite, it's hard to quantify, right? Like grit, right? Well, we have a very strong non-commissioned officer corps full of grit, national resolve, will to win. What's the factor of the will to win factor? How do you categorize that on a number scale? You can't really do that, right? But these things, physical, moral, and mental forces, are real things. That's a real thing. This is why the Spartans at Thermopylae is a great example, right? You got 300 Spartans, they're in this small little spot, they're able to hold off an army of like a couple 100,000 for a couple days. Why? Well, their bronze shields and their bronze breastplates were able to withstand the enemy arms while they were able to punch through the weak wicker armor of the enemy. Yeah, okay, yeah, true. Also, they were Spartans. They'd been trained since they were 7 years old to do nothing but fight wars and win. When they go off to battle, their moms tell them, you come back with your shield or honest. You come back victorious or dead. It would be better for you to come back dead than defeated. Imagine your mom telling you that, right? Like your entire life is dedicated to fighting. And now you're going to get your chance to go, and your mom tells you, listen, if you come back defeated, you best not come back at all. Right? Like, what does that do to your soul? What does that do to your mind? What does that do to your resolve and your determination? Like, how do those things, how do you quantify that? How do you quantify that? Those are very real factors. Again, this is why selection events for special tier forces and stuff are super difficult, because they're trying to suss out who has the moral and mental fiber to make it, who's got the grit, who's got the will to impose their will on the enemy, who's not going to quit, right? Those are the real, intangible, unquantifiable forces that make very real differences in combat throughout all of human history, right? What if you just have a general who's super brilliant? You get a Napoleon, you get a Caesar, maybe not an Alexander. I don't know if Alexander was brilliant, very brave, very daring, had the will to win, right? But what happens when you get a guy like that? What do you do then when you have a Rommel, right? When you have these people that are exceptionally brilliant at executing battles, how does that affect the actual fighting on the ground, right? When you have, like I said, an exceptional corps of non-commissioned officers or experienced frontline officers, what does that do to your fighting force? These are things you can think about. Again, you can't really quantify them, but you need to understand them. You need to understand that they're real things. You need to understand that when you're trying to hit that new peak deadlift number, you're building resolve and mental forces there. And when you're pushing your guys to do those hill sprints every week or hit their burpees, you're help building their resolve or their mental forces. Things that aren't exactly quantifiable, but certainly, absolutely, undoubtedly have impact on the battlefield. I think there's this line by the Duke of Wellington, and it was something to the effect of the Battle of Waterloo was won on the I wanted to say Quidditch. That's not real. That's from Harry Potter. That's pretty bad. It was won on it's not polo, lacrosse. I think he said lacrosse field. I don't know if lacrosse was a sport then. Maybe it was polo. But some point that the Battle of Waterloo was won on the sports field, right? Because, again, that's where they built the teamwork and the resolve and the grit and the determination and fighting spirit and et cetera, et cetera. Esprit de corps, right? So, we've belabored that enough, but you have to understand there are a lot of forces that just aren't quantifiable, that are part of the human dimension that influence the outcome of battles. So lastly, we have the evolution of war. Now there are two attributes or categories here. The first one is the evolution of war. And then the second one is going to be the science and the art. So the evolution of war. Some things never change and some things do, right? So for example, when we talked about the human dimension, you can never ever eliminate the human dimension from war. War will always involve people. It will always involve people. There's no way around that. At the end of World War II, people thought, oh, well, we don't really need armies anymore. We have nuclear weapons. We'll just fly by, drop some nukes on them. That'll solve the war. Ironically, right, since World War II, we've had more ground troops as America in more places to fight more wars than ever before, right? So you can't eliminate the human factor ever. That's something that will always be the same. It's always going to be people using extreme violence against other people to try to impose their will. I hope we've belabored that point enough on the bad guy. Always going to be the case, always going to happen. So there are things like that that are just never going to change. There are things that do change. Technology, for example, is a great driver. In World War II, they developed penicillin. And when they developed penicillin, suddenly less people died in combat because we had a better technology to save people from infection. Again, we mentioned earlier, drones are really hot right now, right? That's the new hotness. Well, is that a change? Is that an evolution in war? Sure. Is it going to change some tactics and how people look to do things? Yeah, I suppose it will. In the same way that machine guns change things, right? Or artillery or the tank. Like, these things changed the way we do fighting. Okay. At the same time, it's still people stepping onto a field or into a battle area or whatever, trying to impose their will on other people. That will never change. So you have to understand that there are things that are going to change, and you just have to be adaptable to that. And I'll admit, right, I'm kind of about the drone thing. Like, I'm very sus, but it doesn't really matter what I think. It's going to change the way things happen. Now, what it won't change is the fact that people, light infantry, we've had light infantry since we've left the Garden of Eden, and we will have them until Jesus comes back. You're always going to need people to do the thing. Science and art. So there's a science to war, right? Well, the range of this artillery system is so-and-so many meters, right? This mortar can reach so many meters, delivering this many pounds of explosive at, within this accuracy range to provide this much lethality within this given radius, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a science to these things that, some of which you need to know, right? Well, this is how we stop the blood flow. This is how we, like for the tourniquet, I'm saying, this is the effective range of the 5.56 round or the 308 round, or, this is how many pounds this weighs and how much should be reasonably expected for a healthy adult male to carry over this distance, et cetera, et cetera. There's lots of science things we can and should know about war. There's also the art factor. How are we applying those sciences, right? War is both a science and an art. And the art comes into applying the sciences or applying the attributes or understanding the attributes to meet certain goals or twist them in certain facets, right? This is where the great generals of history make their mark because they're extremely well versed in the art of war, right? There's a book called that by Sun Tzu, right? They understand the art aspect. They're there to think creatively and solve problems and be the grand artist of violence and death, right? Like that's what they're good at. And you have to understand that both of those things are important and that you need to master, have an understanding of, have a healthy respect for, be trained in, however you want to say it, the art and the science of war, and just know that those factors exist. There's another great line. I just want to read just straight from the book because I can't say it any better. We thus conclude that the conduct of war is fundamentally a dynamic process of human competition requiring both the knowledge of science and the creativity of art, but driven ultimately by the power of human will. So I hope that you found this first lecture series helpful on the nature of war. Remember, it all comes back to the will, right? Imposing our will, having the will to win, having the human drive and will to see it through. We have to fight through our different attributes of friction and uncertainty and fluidity and disorder and complexity. We have to deal with human dimensions of just people being people and dealing with violence and danger and fear of the physical, moral, and mental factors that can't always be quantifiably understood or calculated for, but are very real and make very big differences. And then we have to understand that war changes over time. There's a science aspect to this and there's an art aspect to this, and your job as a everyday American Minuteman is to understand all of these things, wrap them together, weave through all the problems to solve them so that you can impose your will on the enemy before they impose it on you. We'll see you for the next one. Do brave deeds and endure.